I am in love. I actually celebrated my 10-year anniversary just last month. Uh, Not with a human person, actually. I'm in love with my job. And I know that being married to your work usually has negative connotations, but I truly mean it in the absolute best way. I love what I do. So, what is my job? I work in cellular agriculture, which is the production of things from cells instead of whole organisms. Specifically, I focus on cultured meat, also known as lab grown meat, which is meat produced from cells instead of animals. Obviously, the meat that we eat today comes from animals. We breed and raise and feed and slaughter animals and then harvest their muscle and fat tissues to create meat. The concept behind cultured meat is asking the question, can we remove the animal from this process? If we can create meat without animals that are sentient, that produce methane, that carry diseases, then maybe we can make meat that is more humane, more sustainable, more safe. Cultured meat is made by taking stem cells from an animal and then growing them outside of the animal. The cells divide exponentially in a process called proliferation, and then they mature into muscle tissues and fat tissues that make up meat through a process called differentiation. And we do this by basically tricking the cells into thinking that they're still inside of an animal. So we control their temperature, their exposure to nutrients, and other aspects of their environment. And I am not kidding when I tell you that I am head over heels in love. I mean, like, absolutely obsessed with this weird concept. There are a lot of other talks that you can find on the internet that describe the benefits of cultured meat and exactly how it's made. For this talk, I just wanted to share my personal romantic relationship with my career in cultured meat. So, we all know that every good relationship begins with a meet cute, or in my case, a meet cute. I think you got it already. So, the story goes I was in college and I was taking a bioethics course, and we were debating the morality of using animals both for the medical industry and for the food industry. And this was a topic that got me really riled up. Back in high school, I had an experience that led me to become a vegetarian overnight. And this led me to, as it tends to do, to suddenly try to convince everyone around me to also become a vegetarian overnight. I remember emailing my friends these fact sheets that I had typed up about the intelligence levels of chickens and forcing my family to eat this tofurkey that I concocted for Thanksgiving. I even applied for an unpaid summer internship at PETA in Los Angeles, which my parents did not let me go to. And I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that not a single friend or family member around me changed their meat consumption at all due to my preaching. So I remained vegetarian, but I stopped pestering everyone around me. And I actually slowly gave up hope that I could ever influence meat consumption outside the scope of my own personal diet. So now, fast forward to college, and I'm sitting in this class, and someone was actually asking me to share my opinions on this subject and to share my chicken fact sheets. So, this was so incredibly validating. And in that moment, sitting there in that class, I decided somehow I'm going to use my degree, which was in chemical and biological engineering, to help animals somehow. And at the time, the path that made the most sense was on the medical side, to use tissue engineering to create little in vitro human tissues to test drugs on those so that we didn't have to test drugs on animals. So I'm Googling around the internet, typing in search terms like cell culture, tissue engineering, animal welfare, and that's when it happens. My meet cute. Google had spit out an article about using tissue engineering, not to address the medical use of animals, but to address the food use of animals. Millions of animals are used in research each year, but billions and billions and billions of animals are slaughtered for food each year. The takeaway being that cultured meat had the potential to spare billions of animals without requiring people to change their behavior. We could produce the exact same things that people love to eat, but just change the way they're produced. This was my love at first sight moment. The second stage of a relationship is courtship, where you're learning more about your partner and you're trying to get them to want you back. I learned more about cultured meat through an internship I had at this amazing nonprofit called New Harvest that advocates for the technology. Initially, I had only really seen the benefit of cultured meat for animals, but there's actually a much larger vision. Cultured meat could help combat climate change. For example, cultured beef is projected to use significantly less land, less water, and produce less greenhouse gas emissions compared to farmed beef. It could also revolutionize public health. Cultured meat could reduce foodborne illness, infectious disease, antimicrobial resistance, all problems that arise because farmed meat is brought with pathogens. Cultured meat is produced in completely sterile production systems, so maybe these problems could be alleviated. Maybe we could rebuild a global food system that not only had a positive impact for animals, but human health, the planet, nutrition, biodiversity, culinary innovation. So the more that I learned about cultured meat, the more I thought, this is perfection, and I needed to be a part of it. But it was kind of playing hard to get with me. I graduated from college and I started my job hunt. And at the time, there was only 2 cultured meat companies in the entire world, and they weren't hiring. So I pivoted my focus towards plant-based meat companies. I interviewed at a very well-known plant-based meat company out in California. And I thought that I killed the interview. In fact, I was so confident that while I was waiting to hear back about the job, I just drove out to California, across the country, only to get there and learn, to my surprise, that I did not get the job. So, what do we do when the object of our affection doesn't want us back? We go no contact, right? Yeah, that works. So I pretended to move on, and I spent a year working at a software startup, as one does in Silicon Valley. And then one day I was sitting at my desk, and the nonprofit that I had interned for in college reached out to me and told me they were starting a fellowship program. They were going to fund a PhD student to study cultured meat research right here at Tufts University. So I immediately applied for the fellowship. And I thought that I killed the application. So while I was waiting to hear back about the fellowship, I quit my job and started to plan my move across the country. Luckily, I did get the fellowship. And I entered the honeymoon phase of my career. A honeymoon that lasted 5 whole blissful years. For me, this meant tinkering away in a lab, looking at muscle cells twitch under a microscope. I admit, cultured meat is a weird concept. But in case you were wondering, there's actually a lot of room to make it even weirder. My graduate research at Tufts focused on growing meat from insect cells. Imagine eating a piece of sushi. It has a little bit of a unique flavor, and the sushi is actually composed of cells that came from a caterpillar instead of a fish. That was the vision behind my graduate project. Because if someone doesn't like the sound of lab-grown meat, maybe we can get them on board with lab-grown bug meat. Yeah? All jokes aside, there's actually some really compelling reasons to grow meat from insect cells. Insect cells are easier and cheaper to grow than cells from cows or pigs or chickens, and they might have nutritional benefits as well. And if marketing to humans proves challenging, it could be an interesting alternative protein source for pet food. After I graduated, some more students continued on with the insect project, and Tufts actually got a grant from NASA to culture insect cells for space food. They ended up sending a culture of living insect cells into orbit to see if they would survive, and they're still floating around in there, lost up in space. Cultured meat is such a fun topic to study. But getting to tell people when they ask what I do for work that I am looking into lab-grown bug meat for your space pets, that's so incredibly fun. Unfortunately, as we all know, the honeymoon period never lasts. Disillusionment is inevitable. You fall in love with the best sides of someone, with their potential. But as you get to know them, you realize that they aren't perfect. In fact, they're far from perfect, and their specific flaws begin to show. In the context of technology, when something doesn't exist yet, it's really easy to talk about the theoretical benefits, the potential. But as we begin to bring that technology to life, the limitations inevitably materialize. Near the end of my graduate program, the industry as a whole was beginning to mature, and the very real technical limitations came to light. For example, in 2021, a study was published that challenged the promise of cultured meat. A very, very smart chemical engineer spent 2.5 years evaluating the techno-economic feasibility of cultured meat. In other words, given the state of technology, is it actually possible to produce enough cultured meat to feed people at a price that they can afford? To summarize the findings, the report depicted a scenario in its conclusion that under very optimistic assumptions, at best, cultured meat would cost $37 a kilogram, which is 10 times more expensive than a lot of the meat we buy today. You know when you get in a fight with your partner and they begin to list out all the problems in your relationship at once? And they're like, you always do this and you never do that, and you always say you're going to do this and then you don't do it. That was this report for our field, using math and science to back up the arguments and a much more objective tone, but nonetheless. Here are just a few of the challenges that the cultured meat industry faces. One example is expensive media. Just like animals, cells need to eat in order to grow. The food we feed the cells is called cell cultured media, and it's incredibly expensive. As you can imagine, expensive inputs lead to expensive outputs. Another problem is limited growth. In theory, cells can divide forever, exponentially, infinite beat, but in practice, cells will stop growing if their environment becomes unfavorable. So if they run out of nutrients or they become too crowded, they'll stop growing. In really large vessels, it's hard to ensure that the environment is always optimal for growth. Another problem is product quality. None of this matters at all if, when someone's at a grocery store and they're presented with two options, cultured meat and farmed meat, they're actually selecting to buy cultured meat. And that won't happen unless the product quality is equivalent or superior. Creating something like a hot dog with cultured meat technology is relatively simple, but creating any meat with structure, like a steak, is pretty challenging. There are non-technical challenges too. Companies need to raise money, which is difficult, and marketing this completely new product for consumer acceptance might prove challenging. And recently, politics have entered the chat and brought up a whole new set of issues. Italy and Florida have actually both passed laws to ban the sale of cultured meat. So now that the flaws are apparent, it's time for the relationship to mature, and relationships mature in one of three ways. The first being termination. Do we decide that the flaws are too big to overcome and end the relationship? Is cultured meat too expensive, not scalable, and therefore we should abandon pursuit? Number two, maintain the status quo. Do we turn a blind eye to the problems and continue on? Or path three. Do we acknowledge the problems that very much exist and commit to trying to fix them? Do we swallow our pride? Do we go to therapy to rekindle the relationship? Even though I may at times fantasize about having other careers that are more attractive, less controversial, it's a real headline. At the end of the day, I'm very committed to this one, for better or for worse. I can honestly say that not once in the past 10 years have I ever seriously considered doing anything else. So despite the long list of challenges to overcome, we're going down path three. cultured meat might not be feasible with the technology that exists today. But that just presents a huge new opportunity to develop new technologies. Earlier this year, two of my colleagues from Tufts and I started a company to solve some of the technical challenges that face the industry. Some of our solutions include using genetic engineering to create more productive cells, and also developing cheaper ingredients to feed the cells. But there are so many problems to solve, and we really need more people to work on solving them. And definitely not just scientists and engineers. We need chefs and farmers and supply chain experts and politicians and graphic designers. It's really hard to think of a discipline that couldn't be applied to this industry. So, if you think that you could fall in love with a career in beef without cows, or eggs without chickens, or caviar without fish, or anything else, I want you to know that you belong in this field and that we would be lucky to have you. So, till death do us part. If the potential of cellular agriculture is actualized within the span of my lifetime, I will die happy, knowing that my one true love was a real one. But I do hope it happens sooner.